Welcome to 100 Plus, an historical overview of 100 of the most important people, events, and ideas of the last 2,000 years. This is a survey of the forces and factors that have shaped today's world, the Christian faith, and you. In today's episode, we're going to look at the field of economics, noting how capitalism emerged from a Christian worldview and how it has profoundly shaped the world, in particular, the West. Today's topic might surprise you. It's on economics in general and capitalism in particular. I'm guessing some of you are thinking, the law of supply and demand? Really? The dismal science? Really? Are you going to tease out the debate between the Keynesians and the neoclassicals? Or are we going to talk about monetary theory and the Fed? I didn't see this coming. So you're surprised. You may be aware that capitalism is one of the most famous isms out there. But you're still surprised. You didn't think that I'd select this as one of the 100 most important topics in what is largely an overview of church history. But this really is a no-brainer. For starters, our world is defined by economic activity. We live in a world of trade. I'm not simply talking about the trade between the U.S. and Mexico or the U.S. and China, although there is that, and it matters a lot. I'm talking about the trade between the grocer and you. When you go to buy food, you decide that you are going to trade money that you have for a can of soup or something else because you think that that would be a good deal. You voluntarily, willingly decide that this is a win for you. So you're willing to trade with the grocer or to go to Starbucks and trade $2.50 for a cup of coffee. Our world is all about trade, and trading lies at the heart of capitalism. We no longer live as self-sufficient entities or families. It's assumed that you will specialize in something, like building cars or taking care of the sick, and that you are going to depend upon other people to specialize in other things, like teaching children or growing food. And that everybody will get together and then willingly trade the money they have acquired by their specialization for some goods or services that other people have. And you will believe that that is a win for you. Capitalism is the idea that when this happens, it's a good deal for both parties and that the wealth of the nation is going to increase. You may not have thought about how unique this is. You may not have thought about the fact that not every country has private property and open markets. Instead, they favor collective ownership and heavy state involvement. They live in a world in which everything is owned by collectively or it's owned by the government, and the government is going to decide what kind of trades can take place, and they're going to set prices, and they're going to predetermine what color everything is going to be. So you may not have thought about how differently you live today because of capitalism and free markets and other things, but it is significant. So the first reason that I am devoting one of these lectures to this topic is because it does impact pretty significantly how we live. What we do and how we buy and sell is a big topic. The second reason I have chosen economics and capitalism as one of the top 100 topics is because we cannot do justice to the Bible without talking about money and work and how we treat each other and how society is structured and the rules for exchanging goods and services. In short, we cannot look at the Bible and not talk about economics. God cares about all of these things. We find them throughout the Bible. Some, noting that there are over 2,000 verses in the Bible discussing money and lots of passages about how we think about possessions and material security and how to treat an employee and the like. Some would claim that economics is among the most frequently broached subjects in all of Scripture. Over half of Jesus' parables involve economic themes, and some of these, such as the parable of the talents, seem to endorse capitalism almost straight up. In Acts 19, we read about the dust-up in Ephesus that happens when the silversmith named Demetrius who made little silver trinkets, is all up in arms because these little silver trinkets that he's making to the god Artemis are being undermined. The sale of these trinkets are being undermined by Paul's preaching. Proverbs 16, there's a call for fair scales. In Matthew 21, Jesus gets mad about money exchanges being unjust. The Bible has texts talking much about the concern over poverty and wages and justice and taxes, and all of these are economic issues. It should not surprise us in light of this that in Thomas Aquinas' 13th century tome, Summa Theologica, he writes about economics, asking questions such as, what is justice and how do we deal with poverty? In his institutes, Calvin has whole sections devoted to government and economics. Theologians write about economic issues because everything matters to God, especially the things that have such a profound impact on the way we live. Perhaps economics is not the most important topic in the Bible, but it's a prominent one. We cannot avoid talking about it. The third reason I am talking about capitalism, the economic system in play in the West and in the U.S. in particular, is because it has profoundly shaped the U.S. You cannot understand your life without understanding how much of it has been shaped by this whole approach to property and trade and justice issues. Our 21st century Western society is largely based on capitalism. It's not pure capitalism, and many complain that the state is still too big and too controlling, but we live in a very complex capitalistic society that is based on hundreds of millions of transactions taking place every day. Our advanced economy has lots and lots of moving parts, and these, again, just profoundly shape our life. One of the things that economists ask is, why did the U.S. develop in such a way that there is advanced medical care in New York City, but slightly less advanced medical care in Duluth, Minnesota, and even less advanced medical care in certain parts of Central Africa? So this is a big topic. It's an important topic. The fourth reason we're looking at economics in general, capitalism in particular, is because it grows out of, I will argue, it grows out of a Christian worldview. In today's episode, I am not only noting that capitalism is one of the major forces shaping your world, I am arguing that it gives us financial leverage that has elevated our world and is caring for people, and that all of these sort of moving pieces emerge out of a Christian worldview. Now, please hear me. I am not suggesting that capitalism is perfect. Not at all. There is no such thing as a perfect system in the broken world in which we live. And even if capitalism was perfect, it would not unfold in perfect ways when it's you and me that are employing it, right? We are broken, and pretty much everything we touch is going to be tainted in some way, shape, or form. However, I am going to say that private property and rule of law and the rise of trade and the division of labor, those things that mark capitalism, those things that have fostered such a dramatic increase in global wealth, that has, among other things, elevated the most desperately poor, many of them, 1 billion of them, out of desperate poverty. We've lost some ground in recent years because of COVID, but that many of these things are in part outgrowths of a Christian worldview. So let me note, in a survey like this, I cannot nuance my argument as much as I should. Not everyone endorses the idea that capitalism grows out of a Christian worldview. In one of the monographs that I read, The History of Capitalism, 600 to 1900, it argues, a handful of academics argue that a lot of Islam sort of comes out of, a lot of capitalism comes out of Islam and the caravan systems in the Middle East, and they try to build the case that Muhammad, who was a merchant for a number of decades before he announces that he is a prophet of God, that Muhammad sort of drives a lot of capitalism. I disagree that it starts there. I think you can make the case that certainly it's in play there, but I think it gets started much earlier than that, and it's growing again out of Christianity. But one of the things I will argue, one of the reasons I'm focusing on capitalism is because it's not only important and largely helpful, not perfect, but has upsides, but one of the reasons I'm highlighting it is because I think it grows out of the Christian assumptions and it elevates the West. And so if we're going to understand our world today, if we're going to understand this moment in which we are living, we have to understand the impact of capitalism, and then we also need to understand and appreciate that capitalism is shaped by Christianity. So, the first reason I'm doing this is because we live in an economic world. The second reason is because the Bible has much to say about economics. The third is because capitalism has profoundly shaped the West. And the fourth is because Christianity has profoundly contributed to capitalism. So, having said all that, we are now turning to the 57th topic that we have picked up. We are in the 18th century, moving right along, making our way towards the 21st century, doing so with the hope that when we finally arrive at the 21st century, we will have a better, a clearer, a more accurate understanding of how we got here, not just so that we know more stuff about the past, but so that we can live more thoughtfully and follow Jesus more faithfully. And today, as noted, our topic is economics and capitalism. We talked a little bit about some of this back in an earlier episode when I spoke about the Protestant work ethic. You might remember that was Max Weber, the 20th century German sociologist who was interested in the different economies that he was seeing emerge between Catholics and Protestants. He'd been hired by his Prussian government to try and figure out what was going on, and he is going to suggest that a lot of this grows out of Calvinism and some uniquenesses there that led Protestants to emphasize diligence and discipline and frugality and other things. So he is going to have he wrote The Protestant Work Ethic in the Spirit of Capitalism. So we talked a little bit about this before, but I want to go a little bit deeper today. And I want to start with some definitions. So economics is the study that emerged during the 18th century of how societies deal with limited resources. It's not just about money. It's just about any limited resource. How do groups of people deal with the fact that there's not enough of everything for everybody to have as much of everything as they want? So what happens when that happens? In his basic textbook, in his intro textbook called Basic Economics, Thomas Sowell, who's, I think, a very clear, interesting writer. If you're going to try and read an economics textbook, then you want to find one that's well written, and I think he's a brilliant writer. In it, he defines economics as the study of the use of scarce resources which have alternative uses. The word itself comes from the Greek oikos, which means household, and nomos, which means law. So oikos, nomos, economics is sort of the household management. It's the study of household management, how you're going to deal with limited time, limited resources to live your life. Capitalism is an economic system, and it's hard to define. Almost everybody that you read who you think should be able to define capitalism, such as Adam Smith or Karl Marx or some of these people, everybody seems to either avoid trying to define it or they complain that it's a uniquely difficult word to define. The term eludes a universal and essentialist definition. I'm quoting from one of the books I read. So then they start to just list aspects or descriptors of capitalism: private property, open competitive markets, rule of law, contracts, those kinds of things. And again, Adam Smith, so arguably the father of capitalism, doesn't use the word capitalism. By the way, the word capitalist was a derogatory term. It was sort of a bad word. You didn't want to be called a capitalist, and so some groups of people leaned into it, but lots of people didn't like it. So Adam Smith doesn't use it, and Karl Marx uses it very seldom in all of his writings. So anyway, what it basically says, capitalism is basically the system in which people are largely free to do what they want and expected to operate in their own best interest, with the idea that if we are operating in our own best interest, we are going to create some upsides to us. And when that happens in a society, collectively, everybody sort of takes a step up. There is a wealth created in the nation. In a capitalistic system, people and companies, not the government, own most of the property. Secondly, there is a division of labor, so people specialize. In a family, you realize that someone is better off growing the grain and someone is better off making the bread. In a company, you realize that some people are better making chairs and some people are better growing food. Furthermore, those who are better making chairs, some of them are better pounding nails and some of them are better at sanding. And you just keep dividing and dividing and dividing and increasing efficiency as you go down the line. A third aspect of the capitalist system is that there is a free exchange of goods and services. By free, I mean the government doesn't set the price. The market does. The invisible hand of the market, which is basically the sort of collective decisions of millions and millions of different people, is going to determine what the fair price is. In a capitalistic system, the government plays a secondary role. In a Marxist or socialist or communist system, you're going to have more centralized control. It's going to be a command economy as opposed to a free market. And so those are the two big divides. In a capitalist system, you also, you do not sneer at the idea of turning a profit. It's not only acceptable, indeed, profits need to be created so that you can reinvest in the system and continue to grow and see improvement happen. So, because capitalism is a challenge to define, let me keep trying. The word itself, as I said, comes from capital, meaning something of value, money or a factory or farmland or any sort of good that could be traded. It could be, by the way, it could be a ship. It could be all kinds of things could be capital. They just have to have a capacity to return income. So Rodney Stark, one of the historians of this time that I have been looking at, defines capitalism this way. He said, capitalism is an economic system wherein privately owned, relatively well-organized, and stable firms pursue complex commercial activities within a relatively free, that is unregulated, market, taking a systematic, long-term approach to investing and reinvesting wealth in productive activities involving a hired workforce and guided by anticipated and actual returns. Sorry about that. That is a mouthful, but again, I think maybe it's best to think of capitalism in relationship to the alternatives. So again, you have in capitalism, you have sort of the opposite. You have the free market and private property, the opposite of socialism or Marxism. Now within capitalism, you have Keynesian economists and neoclassicals and Austrian schools. You got all kinds of different approaches to this. And you should also understand there's no such thing as a purely capitalistic society, just as there's no such thing as a purely socialist society. We all have mixed economies today. And furthermore, understand that this whole, we're looking in the 18th century, Adam Smith, so you can remember his book, The Wealth of Nations, comes out in 1776. Some economists will argue a more important piece of paper than the Declaration of Independence. I'm not going to go there, but it's changed. Capitalism has changed in the last 250 years, and the world has gotten a lot more complicated. But I mean, for instance, China learned what the Soviets didn't learn, and China has embraced aspects of capitalism, but they've embraced it into a whole new system. So Adam Smith is writing in the middle of the 18th century, and it's a very different day today. So capitalism continues to evolve, but just trying to get the general flow of things as we try to understand how we got to today. So before we turn to a little bit of the history and to Adam Smith in particular, let me say just a bit about the foundations of capitalism and about the critiques of capitalism. So I have stated that I think capitalism emerges out of a Christian worldview. It emerges out of a view of the world, a set of assumptions in which we think that the world is good. It was created by a good God. It's orderly. It can be developed. It also develops out of a system which understands work to be good. So this is a biblical idea. So you go back to other traditional societies and you see, like the Romans, the Roman wealthy were never going to work. It was beneath them. You go to some of the Chinese, ancient Chinese, they would grow their fingernails as long as they could to advertise that they did no work because work was demeaning. So as Christians, we understand that work has been cursed and it's harder than we would like it to be. However, work was something God did. He worked for 6 days. He rests on the seventh. And the command to work comes before the fall. So Luther is going to advocate work in the Protestant Reformation. He's going to celebrate work, to celebrate not just the work of the priests, but celebrate the work of everybody. But even way before that, we're going to see a real celebration, a goodness of the land, a goodness of work that is going to be part of the Christian story. So additionally, you see in the Bible that property rights are a good thing, and the rule of law is a good thing. So to be clear, we don't own anything in the ultimate sense. God owns everything everywhere, but there is a sense in which we have been given things, and we are stewards of things, and there are rules. So some people would say, no, when we look at the New Testament, and we look at Acts chapter 4, and we see the early church, they were sharing everything in common. Yeah, it gets held up as an ideal, but understand, they owned it and were sharing it, right? It wasn't owned by the state. There wasn't a central control of this. It was owned by the people, and they were choosing to be generous with what they had. And in some of the medieval times, when you've got feudalism in place, yes, the serfs, the peasants can't leave the land, but the land can't be taken from them either. They have property rights, and so there's just an understanding of private property, rule of law, and all of these things. We are expected to be good stewards of the world we've been given. There's a cultural mandate given to us in Genesis 1 that we're to be stewards over the world, but we have ownership, and we are to cultivate that. We're to be good stewards, the whole parable of the talents. And so, see, all these ideas are sort of infusing this movement towards capitalism. One of the interesting little side notes here is that when I was working as the leader of Scholar Leaders International, we saw suddenly an increased interest by the Chinese in having people study Christianity. And what we learned was they were interested in having people study Christianity because they thought that Christianity was part of the key to capitalism, which was elevating the West. And so they saw this link between Christianity and capitalism. Now, again, I want to be really clear. There are downsides to capitalism. And what I advocate for capitalism. I occasionally get accused of being, a Marxist by some. But no, I advocate for capitalism. I believe that capitalism, shaped by Christian compassion and Christian convictions, is the best system we can have in this broken world. So it's not just pure capitalism. It is capitalism shaped by Christianity. But there are critiques, not just by, Karl Marx, not just by Ibram Kendi, who says capitalism is sort of inherently racist and racism is capitalistic. There's a lot of critiques against capitalism, but I'm particularly interested in the critiques that come out of the church. And so, again, Acts chapter 4, some people say the Bible calls on us to share all things in common. Yes, we are to be incredibly generous, but it also advocates for property rights. Some people are nervous about capitalism because it is based on a system in which we are doing what's in our own best interest. It sort of leverages greed. And this gets tricky, although I would argue that God never calls on us to operate outside of our own best interest. We just generally don't understand what's in our best interest. And we need to live in light of eternity, not in light of the next quarter returns. But there is a caution there. There's the whole challenge we find throughout Scripture that not only is greed bad, but the love of money is the root of all sorts of evil. And so that's a challenge. There's additionally challenges that come at capitalism that it is disruptive. So one of the things that capitalism will advocate is the creative destruction of things. So if you're working for a company and the company puts out widgets, but then somebody comes out with a better way to make widgets, your company is going to go under, and you will suffer in light of that. And we see periods of great tumult. That's the Industrial Revolution, is a period of great tumult and lots of people suffering. And you just read Dickens and all the people that are moving into the city because the farming is changing, and now that you got the plow, you don't need nearly as many people working the fields. And so they're being displaced, and they're going into the factories, and the factories are being they're being run by heavy-handed, greedy people who are not paying a living wage, and you got child labor, and you got all kinds of problems. Yes, these are issues, these are real concerns. We can argue, and I would argue that there's pain in the system, whatever way you look at it, and that usually the market, especially the market, when there are Christians trying to shape it and push it, is going to lead to the value of humans and child labor laws and all these kinds of things. So, look, I want to be clear. This is not an unbridled endorsement of capitalism. There are issues with capitalism, but I just don't think that there's a better alternative. So I would say about capitalism what Churchill said about democracy, and you probably know this, Churchill said about democracy that it's the worst form of government except for all the other forms of government. So you could say about capitalism, it's the worst form of economics except for all the other forms of economics. It clearly is better than its competition. Study history, right? Oh my goodness, socialism doesn't work, and it creates far more pain and suffering than the creative destruction that happens. People generally all want to live in capitalistic systems, right? Ronald McDonald did what neither Hitler nor Napoleon had been able to do. He marched into Moscow and he set up shop and he began to take over. So look, there are a number of reasons why people will say the West, quote unquote, won, that globalization has become the westernization of the world. They'll say that it's because the West was first to the Enlightenment, or the West was the first to embrace science. Others will say it's the natural advantages, the resources that the West has had. Others will say that it's just the West exploited other people. There's all kinds of things. I would argue that the Christian influence on culture has helped the West in many ways. And that one of the things that the Christian faith has done is it has contributed to the rise of capitalism. So let me just make a couple points here as we begin to wrap things up by giving you some historical overview. So the world has transitioned through a variety of different economic models. As you can imagine, in earlier periods, people were largely self-sufficient. There was no division of labor outside of the family, so you were growing your own food, someone in the family was making the clothes and fixing all the food, hunting, and again, very little division of labor. We start to see division of labor as we start to see people moving into cities. And we get a little bit of comment about economics for the first time by Aristotle in the 4th century BC. Remember, the Greeks are giving us some of the earliest city-state models and those kinds of things. So Aristotle, by the way, doesn't much care for the whole market and economics. He doesn't like people growing more food than they need and then trying to use that to get other things. He doesn't think of commerce as being a particularly good idea, but it's going to begin to happen. Now, he will have some compatriots with those who are going to be looking at the Old Testament laws against, in particular, against usury, against charging interest. And we're going to see that in the Old Testament, and you're going to watch, you do see as people try and struggle with this as economics change, you'll have theologians talking about where usury applies and where it doesn't apply, and there will be some, I think, a little bit of selective decision-making on that front. Then as we get into out of the Old Testament, we move into the Roman Empire again in the intertestamental period. And in Rome, you're going to have a big economy that is going to be based a lot on violence and overrunning people groups and then taxing them very heavily, and also, of course, on slave labor. And then you will see, coming out of some of that, you'll see the development in the Middle Ages of guilds, which are sort of powerful unions, more powerful than a lot of unions today. And then as Rome falls, we move into more of a feudal system where the king in an area is going to give land to a set of nobility in exchange for their help in protecting the king against other kings, or aiding in not just defense but in offensive overtaking more land. But the nobles are going to farm out that land to peasants or to the serfs. And the serfs are going to sort of be allowed to stay on the land and to eat some, but it's very minimalistic. There's just a lot of poverty at this point. And you'll get some experimentation with capitalism when we look at the monasteries. And you'll have these communities where there's actually going to be a division of labor, and there's going to be a real celebration of frugality and a celebration of work. And so you're going to have, I think particularly in monasteries, perhaps this is also true in the convents, the nunneries, but you'll have lots of, you'll have a group of men who are going to celebrate work and who are going to live very austere lives, and so they're going to trade. They are going to see they're going to have a lot more than they need, so they're going to start to grow wealthy. They're going to grow more land, or they're going to buy more land, and they're just going to be this. Previously, if people had a lot of money, they would bury it, right, because they didn't want to lose it, or they would show off their wealth in very ostentatious displays. But the monks are not going to do that, and so they're going to start to use that money to acquire more land and more means of production, and they're going to grow wealthier, which again is one of the challenges that the monasteries face, is that initially the people that sign up are all for the life of prayer and devotion and dedication, and it's very simple living and very simple food, and then after a while they've accumulated all this wealth, and so the thread count of their wardrobe goes up, as does the calorie count of their meals. So you've got those challenges. But then we move out of the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, and we begin to have more of a mercantile system, which sees the world as sort of a zero-sum game. There's a certain amount of stuff out there, and if you have more, then I have less. And Adam Smith is going to argue in his book, The Wealth of Nations, that no, there actually can be ways through a division of labor and trade that we have win-win scenarios and we both end up with more. So Adam Smith will write his book and argue for capitalism. It's not long after that you're going to have Karl Marx writing Das Kapital against capitalism. He's more famous, by the way, for Communist Manifesto, which was just a little pamphlet that lots more people read. But Das Kapital is sort of arguing that the eventual evolution of capitalism will be communism. That capitalism has baked into it this growing inequity, which we have some significant inequity right now. I think there's 6 people in the United States that have over $100 billion. There are some challenges. Now, they're not taking this, right? I mean, Elon Musk doesn't have $100 billion because he's taking money from other people. People want to buy Tesla cars, or people want to buy the batteries that he makes. And Jeff Bezos has $100 billion because they're willing to trade their money for the things that he makes available via Amazon. So the argument is that there is a step up. But you have inequities, and some of that causes lots of political strife and turmoil. And so Marx is going to argue that the eventual end run of capitalism is communism. I don't think so. But Adam Smith is the person who articulates in his seminal work, The Wealth of Nations, the whole capitalistic system. He's called the father of economics and the father of capitalism. So he was born in 1723. He is noted as a Scottish moral philosopher and political economist. He doesn't call himself an economist. I'm not sure there were economists at the time. Educated at the University of Glasgow and then at Oxford. He is a professor in Glasgow, and then he collaborates with David Hume, a rather famous atheist, in some works. Smith will actually write 2 works that survive to today. In 1759, he writes The Theory of Moral Sentiments, and then in 1776, he writes An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. And so again, one of the questions that economists will ask is, why do you have such wealth in the West and a lack of that wealth in other parts of the world? And what is it? And obviously there's a lot of factors that go into this, but that's what economists are trying to figure out. What are the resources, the scarce resources that are getting deployed, and in what ways, when they're deployed, do the most people tend to win? So Adam Smith becomes very famous for his work, and he becomes a celebrity during his life. So he is going to write about the value of free markets, right? That as opposed to a command economy, as opposed to a king dictating what's going to happen, as opposed to some other way, he's going to argue that the collective decision making of tens of millions of people is the right way to go. People will act in their own rational self-interest, and that competition that comes out of that system is going to lead to economic prosperity. And as I noted, I think that some of these ideas are inherent in Christianity. There's a podcast I listened to, Ben Friedman, a Harvard economist, came out with a book a few years ago, and it's called it is called, I don't find the title, but it's called, I think, like The Religious Roots of Capitalism. Well, look, thank you for listening to this episode. I hope it wasn't as bad as you feared. Let me wrap up in saying, if you're an economist, I apologize. I realize I've run roughshod over your discipline. Rushed, it's a dramatically incomplete lecture. There's so much more to say about economics, and of course, economics has evolved in the last 250 years. There's a whole part of things that I didn't even talk about, and that is that a lot of companies get established not for economic gain, but for social good. And we saw that way back during the Industrial Revolution. Guinness, for instance, I think is a company that gets started to create a low alcohol beverage. When the poor were drinking gin because you got into trouble drinking water, they create a lower alcohol beverage. There's lots of companies today that are trying to create social good in addition to economic good as well. So lots to be talked about here, but I just wanted to bring us up to the whole sort of formal start of capitalism with Adam Smith and his book. Next up, I hope in the next episode we will turn and begin to start thinking about America, this unique experiment with a constitution and all that goes into that. See you then.